Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Introvable Chamber. Today, following on from the last discussion on the life of Dante, I will be discussing Dante's Monarchia. When rereading the Monarchia, I was struck by the notion that Dante really does constitute a revolutionary poet, not just in terms of love or romantic poetry. He is, in some senses, a theologian. And as should be evident at the end of today's discussion, he is a political theorist. He is, in some sense, the culmination of classical thought within the medieval era, and yet he is also intrinsically medieval in his outlook. He is as much the product of St. Augustine and Aquinas as he is the product of Cicero and Virgil. Something that really struck me as a description was sublime genius. And unfortunately, that is taken from a description of Jean-Jacques Rousseau by one Benjamin Constant. And of course, if there's ever going to be a term which is misapplied to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, it is sublime genius. But I think in the case of Dante, it is very much apt. And indeed, he is a genius claimed by both medievalists and Renaissance historians. He is considered to be an exemplar of both of these respective disciplines. And indeed, the idea that Dante is a genius isn't lost on Dante himself. Just reading from the beginning of the Monarchia, for example, for all men whom the higher nature has endowed with a love of truth, this above all seems to be a matter of concern, that just as they have been enriched by the efforts of their forebears, so they too may work for future generations, in order that posterity may be enriched by their efforts. For the man who is steeped in the teachings which form our common heritage, yet has no interest in contributing something to the community, it is failing in his duty. Let him be in no doubt of that, for he is not a tree planted by the rivers of water that bringeth forth his fruit in due season, but rather a destructive whirlpool which forever swallows things down and never gives back what it has swallowed. Thinking often about these things, lest some day I be accused of bearing my talent, I wish not just to put forth buds, but to bear fruit for the benefit of all, and to reveal truths that have not been attempted by others. So this isn't just a claim for genius being a duty, but also Dante's aspirations for originality. Indeed, I don't think you can fault Dante in terms of his aspirations for originality. Last time I ended the conversation at the precipice of the point of his banishment, and there's a reason for that, because the banishment, not just in terms of the political situation in Italy around the turn of the 14th century, features extensively in terms of, you can say, the makeup or the writing of Monarchia and the associated sort of letters that come with it. But also, I think it's informative in terms of the psychological and creative development. Now, to sort of start off this notion of the exile, I'm going to read a poem by Dante, which is from Three Women Have Come Round My Heart, but nevertheless, this poem is very much an indictment against what Dante considered injustice, that being essentially the injustice of his banishment from Florence. I who listen to such noble exiles, taking comfort and telling their grief in divine speech, I count as an honour the exile imposed on me, for if judgment or force of destiny does indeed desire that the world turn the white flowers into dark, it is still praiseworthy to fall with the good. And were it not that the fair goal of my eyes is removed by distance from my sight, and this has set me on fire, I would count on light that which weighs on me. But that fire has already so consumed my bones and flesh that death has put his key to my breast. Even if I was to blame for it, the sun has now circled for several moons, since that was cancelled. If blame dies through repentance, song go hawking, with the white wings song go hunting, with the black hounds which I have had to flee, though they could still make me the gift of peace. It is because they don't know what I am that they don't do so. A wise man will not lock the chamber of forgiveness, for to forgive is fine victory in war. In terms of really summing up the events as to why this occurred, though in the preceding centuries the formal Ghibelline faction, the faction which had aligned with the Hohenstaufens, hence the etymology of Ghibelline, which is actually derived from an Italian rendering of a term associated with the Hohenstaufens, they had been defeated, and the Guelphs had become an ascendant faction in Florence. However, the original ideological schism had been recreated by dividing the ascendant Guelph faction into the Black Guelphs and the White Guelphs, with the Whites, including Dante, asserting the independence of Florence from papal authority. Dante was involved in various disputes between then Pope Boniface VIII and the city's government. It's important to note Dante's role in the Apothecaries Guild as an ambassador to the small city of San Gimignano, though also emphasizing the characterization of him as a sciopolato, or out of work, devoting most of his time to his creative enterprises. His occasional public orations, his minor official roles, and his stint as a city prior in Florentine politics are less significant than his personal identification with the cause of the White Guelphs, which in effect amounted to being a pseudo-Ghibelline. Florence was taken by the Pope's ally Charles de Valois, the Dominus Charles or Lord Charles, who then proceeded to loot Florence. The new government, which was aligned to the popes and the Angevin Capetians, the Capetians being the royal house of France and Charles being the representative of that offshoot, prescribed the White Guelphs as essentially resisting papal and Angevin power, and they condemned Dante to this exile. Dante was offered the chance to present himself to the Black Guelph regime, which had essentially offered a quote-unquote investigation into the crimes of the previous White Guelph regime, which, if anything, was just a series of trumped-up charges of corruption. And indeed, this was applied to Dante, corruption while in office, and he was forced to pay an indemnity. And this, of course, was part of a general attempt to discredit the legacy of the White Guelphs and to usher in this new sort of, I would hate almost to say it's ideological, because when you look at the actions of the Pope and the actions of Dominus Charles, it very much seems to be part of a wider political program for the supremacy of the Pope in Italy and indeed the House of France in Italy, but I digress. Dante refused to pay this indemnity, and as a result of this, he was considered an absconder before his assets were seized, and his exile was declared permanent. And as you can infer from the words of an exile, this was very much considered by Dante to be an injustice. And indeed, this aspect of legitimacy and justice is fundamental in terms of understanding Dante's political outlook, because indeed it is a refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of the Black Guelph regime, which in part explains why essentially Dante not only accepted exile, he would not return, but indeed you can say he remained in exile as a form of self-imposed exile towards the end. In terms of the events that quickly followed, his arch enemy, Boniface VIII, would die, and indeed this represents one of the great ironies of history. Having so aligned the papacy, having so aligned with the House of Capet, which went on to destroy the Hohenstaufens in the south of Italy, to the point of even regiciding one of the Hohenstaufen kings, the young Conradin. The papacy then found itself captured essentially by the throne of France, in particular King Philip IV of France, the Iron King Le Roi Fer. And Boniface himself was essentially murdered by operatives acting on the behalf of King Philip IV of France. So a lot of tragic ironies here, but nevertheless, despite this, and despite the horrific sort of culmination of the alliance between France and the popes, Boniface and his successors were nevertheless completely dedicated to this idea of hierocracy, the idea that the Pope was the ultimate source of temporal authority within the grander scheme of Christendom. This goes on until we arrive at the time where Dante is conceiving of a political formula for Italy, and the political treatise. You can even say the political poem that represents De Monarchia. And for De Monarchia, it doesn't mean monarchy in the abstract. Monarchia here is very much a euphemism for the emperor, the monarch who is monarch of all. And the major sort of political changes that occur between Dante's exile and the writing of the Monarchia is that there is an emperor for the first time, an emperor that descends down into Italy and tries to impose a new Ghibelline regime there. Now, to put this in reference, since the decimation of the Hohenstaufens some 50 years before, the imperial power, even within Germany compared to Italy, had been utterly routed. The base of power for the Hohenstaufens in Italy had been taken over by the French and the Aragonese, and the original Duchy of Swabia, which was the heartland of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, had not only been lost to the Hohenstaufens, but had undergone the most rapid, accelerated process of disintegration within the whole makeup of the Holy Roman Empire, which is essentially a long sort of allegory for political decentralization. So with all of these things taken into consideration, the election and arrival of a new emperor during this great span of time known as the Great Interregnum is nothing short of a momentous event. And again, I'm referring back to the autobiography, The Lives of Dante, which I brought up last time, because it really is superlative in terms of being able to lay out the context for what exactly is going on during this time. And I'm going to be reading quite a lengthy section before I finally come to discussing the text of De Monarchia itself, but this should form the background as to what exactly is going on in Italy around the year 1309 to 1314, these pivotal events in Italian politics and history, and how exactly Dante figures into this grand scheme, you can say, of political and conceptual thought at this time. The propaganda of a poet. Dante probably received the news of the Emperor Henry's election, that of his coronation at Aachen on the 6th of January 1309, and that is the election of the would-be emperor as the King of the Romans. There is no guarantee that the King of the Romans would then be able to march south to receive his formal coronation by the Pope in Italy. Indeed, this, as far as memory serves, this had not occurred since Frederick II Hohenstaufen almost 100 years before. The popes had essentially tried to make emperors, such as Rudolf von Habsburg, nevertheless, not very successfully, because seldom did these very sort of tentative holders of the office of elected King of the Romans want to venture out of their sort of main political dimensions within the Holy Roman Empire. That of his coronation at Aachen on the 6th of January 1309, and the acceptance of this election by Pope Clement V, one of Boniface VIII's successors, through the pontifical letter of the 26th of July, Divinae Sapientiae. The imperial coronation was set to take place at the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome in February of 1311. Everyone in Tuscany followed the events. Giovanni Vernani in Florence at the time writes in his chronicle that Philip the Fair, Philip IV, was irritated by the speed of the election, behind which he suspected the machinations of one Cardinal de Prato. And again, this is a king very much concerned with his own prerogatives, to the point essentially that he is in part responsible for wresting the papacy away from Rome and essentially subjecting him to the Babylonian captivity in Avignon. During the Diet of Speyer in summer of 1309, Henry VII announced his intention to travel to Italy. Around a year later, Clement V ordered all the lay and ecclesiastical faithful to obey the new king in the epistle Exultant in Gloria, essentially to exalt glory, obviously. For the first time since the death of Frederick II, it seemed that the interregnum was truly over. Henry VII sent 2 ambassadors to Italy to prepare for his arrival, one to the north and the other to the centre of the peninsula. He asked the lords and communes to receive him with the dignity he deserved and to prepare a general truce in Italy, which for most of the cities meant making peace with their banished citizens, also perhaps including Dante. Many communes accepted and promised to do so. However, only Florence took its time and made known its opposition to the proposal. again as being part of the overall scheme of the Black Guelphs, i.e. aligned to the prerogatives of the papacy, despite the fact, again, that the papacy is in some respect actually trying to facilitate the return of an emperor if it means the return of peace in the peninsula. It is possible that Cino de Pistoia was already part of the imperial delegation when it visited Florence. His presence is certainly attested the following year when the delegation arrived in Rome. Cino was at that time one of the judges of Louis of Savoy, leader of the imperial embassy, who had become a senator, a governor of the Commune of the Urbs. Faced with the evolution of the international situation, Dante's friend therefore decided to put himself at the service of the newly elected king of the Romans. However, the possibility that Dante was at Cino's side during this mission remains merely a hypothesis. The only argument in favour is a passage from Biondo de Flavio. In it, he claims to have read a letter sent from Forli by Dante in his own name and that of the banished Whites to Cangrande della Scala, Lord of Verona, in which he reported the response of the commune of Florence to Henry's ambassadors, qualifying it as blind and arrogant. The content of this letter might well suggest that this assertion rests on a truthful foundation. However, numerous details, the date of his stay in Forli, the almost official role of Dante as the dictator of the exiled White Guelphs, pose problems since they could well have written and added by Biondo from information he had gleaned from other texts. It's basically trying to ascertain the provenance of this event. It is nevertheless certain that shortly afterwards, Dante composed a letter in which he invites all the powers of the peninsulas, kings, senators of Rome, dukes, marquises, counts, and communes, to welcome the new emperor, the source of all justice. He exhorts them not to resist him due to their greed or personal interests. We find in this letter, these are part of 2 epistles, many of the ideas developed in the special chapter of the Convivio, on the basis of the same theory of the universality of imperial power that the masters of Orleans had expounded, and that Cino, Orleans, one of the great sort of medieval universities, and Cino was also developing in these years. Dante affirms that the rivers, the sea, the beaches, and the mountains belong to the emperor, as do all public goods, and that private possessions are also subject to his law. A complex mixture of references to scripture, and as in the treatise, Virgil presents the new emperor as both a messiah destined to spread light where once there was only darkness, and as the successor of the Trojans through whom peace will triumph in Italy, again obviously referencing the Aeneid. The letter ends with a reminder that Pope Clement V, successor of Peter and the Vicar of Christ, has ordered that the king be honoured, allowing this letter to be dated after the encyclical Exultant in Gloria. Over the following 3 months, Dante's prophetic announcements seemed to come true. Henry pacified the communes of Piedmont, which recognized him as lord and settled in Milan, where many lords and representatives of cities did him homage. They took the opportunity to reconfirm their privileges. Among these lords was one Marcello Malaspina, all of whose rights Henry confirmed. The marquises contributed to the royal expenditure and remained with the king in Milan for the Epiphany of 1311, when he received his second crown, that of the Kingdom of Italy. So just to consider within the grand makeup of the Holy Roman Empire at this time, there were in fact 4 kingdoms, in addition to the Kingdom of Bohemia, which was a separate, wasn't a hereditary kingdom yet, it was an elected monarchy, but nevertheless, it wasn't seen as an intrinsic component of the titles of the Holy Roman Empire. But there was the King of the Germans, the King of the Romans, the King of Italy, and the whole idea that you are the successor of the Lombards, hence the Iron Crown of Lombardy, with Pavia and Milan at the center of this whole sort of conception of Italian monarchy. And of course, the Aralat, the Kingdom of Burgundy, which had already pretty much been dismembered by France and would continue to be dismembered over the next century. In the following spring, Dante found himself in Tuscany, beneath the springs of the Arno, in the mountains in the region of Casentino. We know this thanks to the dates given in his other letters. 2 of these missives concern the role played by Florence in the opposition to Henry VII, and demonstrate how closely Dante was following political developments. Since the previous year, Henry had seen his project of pacification crumble due to the seizure of power by the Viscontis in Milan and the rebellion of many Lombard cities. He besieged Cremona and named as imperial vicars several of his followers, including Alboino, de Scala from Verona, to whom we must return, Florence, where Robert of Anjou stayed from 1310 to 11, after his coronation as King of Sicily, had been negotiating with the French crown since the end of 1310 to convince Clement V to impose on Henry a treaty that would maintain the freedom and autonomy of the Guelph communes after he was crowned emperor. The Pope, as usual, prevaricated. Profiting from the hesitation, at the end of March 1311, the communes of the Guelph Alliance gathered in Florence and decided to ask the Pope to enjoin Henry not to enter their lands without their permission. All these elements enlighten the two letters that Dante wrote in the same period. Dante returns to the providential nature of empire, especially given the absence of the Pope and cardinals from Italy, referencing the Avignon papacy. He accuses the Florentines of not having welcomed the emperor, threatens them again with arguments taken from the Bible, the Aeneid, and other authorities. Emphasis on authorities, I'll come back to it, and invites them to consider the fate of the cities punished by Frederick I and to repent. Frederick I, Hohenstaufen, Barbarossa. Again, Barbarossa being actually an epithet that was bestowed upon him, the Redbeard, by the Italians. The second one of these epistles, dated from the 17th of April, is directly addressed to the emperor, who had by now been taken to Cremona. Once again, leaning even more heavily on classical poets, Dante recalls how much his arrival, the will of God, has revived the hopes of those who longed for peace and justice. These people, however, wonder why he remains in northern Italy. The emperor does not deserve to remain in restricted space because he has jurisdiction over the whole world, limited only by the oceans and the stars. This is directly sort of referencing Dante. If he does not come to Tuscany, Dante asserts Henry will never be rid of his opponents because it is Florence who commands and supplies them. She is the origin of the illness that has afflicted the flock and has not hesitated to make alliances with other sovereigns. She therefore deserves an exemplary punishment. Now, how can one not consider the psychological effect of banishment and him being considered the dictator of the White Guelphs and essentially wanting to launch retribution against the city that has spurned him? But what do these letters reveal about Dante's political experience at this moment? Are they part of some official diplomatic correspondence? If this is the case, in the name of which group or individual does Dante write for? Some have suggested that over the course of the imperial expedition, Dante was the spokesperson of the banished Florentines. However, the arguments in favor of this hypothesis are shaky. In two of his letters, Dante exclusively defines himself as a Florentine, undeservedly in exile, just as he does in the only letter whose opening is still preserved, which is a private missive. It is only when he addresses the emperor that he adds, following his name, and all the Tuscans everywhere who desire peace. This is a unique formula, far from referring to an already established political group, seems rather to refer to a collective subject that Dante wished to create through this letter, and almost with him as its representative. However, no relationship is documented between Dante and the seigneurial branches of the families that supported Henry VII, such as the Guidi, counts of Modigliana. It would be more reasonable to suppose that he had gone to the Casentino as a representative of the Malaspina. The letter that he had sent shortly beforehand to the Marquis Morello makes no reference to any political differences. The Guidi counts of Batifoli, however, were still hesitating between support for the emperor and the faithfulness to Florence. They would soon pick the latter option. Dante wrote 3 short letters while staying with them at the castle of Poppi, one of which is dated from 1311. Although the manuscript that transmits them to us attributes them to Dante, they were sent in the name of the Countess Gerlestecia, daughter of the Count Ugolino of Pisa, and the wife of Count Guido of Batifoli, to Margaret of Brabant, wife of Henry VII. The letters pay homage to the Empress, thank her for a previous letter, and wish her the best as she and her husband begin their reign. Although a passing reference to the providential nature of Henry's arrival seems to confirm that Dante was behind their missives, they otherwise appear to be entirely conventional texts. Diplomatic exchanges could be seen as courtesies between noble women, which may have accompanied diplomatic overtures by their husbands. The letters sent by the Empress, to which these notes respond, were surely part of diplomatic actions taken by Henry's court in order to obtain the support of this important but still wavering family from the Tuscan nobility. What was Dante's role in this overall strategy? Was he merely a dictator who put his rhetorical skills at the service of the wife of a lord who was hosting him? And by dictator, you can almost refer it not just in terms of his leadership of the White Girl faction, but a dictator almost taken literally as to be dictating the words of the letters of his potential patrons. Was he there to represent someone else, whether the banished Florentines or another lord, or as some think, had he been sent to the Guidi counts of Battiafolle as an ambassador by Henry VII to put pressure on them and to convince them to support this imperial expedition? The Virgilian idea, i.e. Virgil of the Aeneid, of imperial jurisdiction in Italy, that Dante defends in his passionate letters, according to which the power of the emperor was not limited to the historical kingdom of Italy, or, to be more legalistic in the grand scheme of the Holy Roman Empire, northern Italy and Tuscany. This realm extended over the whole peninsula, including the islands and the city of Rome, and indeed this idea at the time was revolutionary. It certainly does not correspond to the political project that Henry VII was undertaking over these delicate months, when he found himself in great political and financial difficulties following the renewal of hostilities to previously pacified cities. And just to consider the ambitions, and later one can consider the delusions of Dante, the idea that Rome essentially was a constituent part of the emperor's domain had essentially been rescinded since the donations of Pepin, and this would have been some 600 years before in the 8th century, when the city of Rome wrested its independence away from what would later essentially be known colloquially as the Byzantine Empire among historians. And then the rights of the donation of Pepin were confirmed by the Carolingians, and that effectively is the nucleus of the Papal States. So this idea essentially goes beyond simply asserting some sort of hegemony of Italy, but dethroning the Pope from Rome itself and abolishing the would-be Papal States. This imperial weakness then became an opportunity for those who occupied important positions within the communal institutions of their cities, where they already held certain offices for long periods, if not for life. Thanks to their contributions, Decamino from Treviso, Bonicolosi from Mantua, the Visconti from Milan, and others obtained the titles of imperial vicar, basically the representatives of the emperor, enabling them to reinforce their local power while continuing to block the aspirations of their adversaries. However, these exchanges, although necessary from an economic perspective, complicated relations between Henry VII and the Pope. The Pope, pressured by the Guelphs, Florence, and the Angevins, of course, the French branch in Italy, reproached the emperor for not having fulfilled his role as the pacificator super partes, essentially the Lord bringer of peace. For his part, the emperor desperately needed the goodwill of the Pope to ensure his imperial coronation, and so sought to comply with his various requests. Under such conditions, Henry VII had no interest in claiming sovereignty over the whole of the Italian peninsula as Dante would have wished. At minimum, we can say that there was a profound divergence between the hopes that Dante expresses in his writings, promoting the empire, and the constraints on the emperor, which were essentially political. If we take this divergence into account, without excluding the possibility that Dante was still in contact with figures closely linked to the emperor, such as Cino, De Plato, we must conclude that the hypothesis that he played an official role in the context of the imperial expedition remains improbable. It is, however, possible that these political letters circulated, especially in Tuscany, and that they were the primary reason for Dante's exclusion from the amnesty proclaimed by the Florence Commune in September of 1311. The emphasis on this essentially being that even with the pressure of the emperor brought onto the entirety of Tuscany, there wasn't enough essentially to allow for the Black Guelph regime to lament and allow Dante back, which if anything is a tragic indication of his political impotence, despite again apparently being the quote-unquote propagandist of the Emperor Henry VII, the dictator of the White Guelphs. All of these lofty aspirations seem to have completely sort of dissipated into nothing. Nevertheless, at the moment of their composition, these texts seem to have been more the creations essentially of a poet-philosopher who had found in current events a surprising confirmation of the theory he had just elaborated on the basis of his writings of Virgil and Aristotle. The distance between Dante's vision and the policies actually pursued by the emperor diminished over the course of the following 2 years, as the agreement between the Pope and the future emperor faltered. In spite of Henry's imperial coronation at Rome in 1312, his break with Robert of Anjou, Florence, and the other Guelphs led to open war. In the context of a conflict that was getting hotter by the day, the imperial chancellery began using arguments and a tone close to those which Dante had adopted in his letters. But where was Dante? His earliest biographer placed him in Verona or Ravenna, without offering either a precise chronology or supporting documentary evidence. If the hypothesis of a visit to Ravenna in 1312 no doubt anticipates a later stay, that of a journey to Verona in the same year is no more convincing. A recent proposition on this subject, based on an attribution to Dante of a letter composed in the chancellery of Di Scala, has not yet been sufficiently proved. A letter from Petrarch refers to a meeting that happened when he was at the beginning of his Purita, aged around 8, between Dante and his father, the Florentine notary della Ancisa. This would have been Petrarch at the age of 8, who had also been banished from Florence in 1302. Since Petrarch claims elsewhere that he spent his 8th year in Pisa and then left with his family for Avignon, we place Dante at Genoa or Pisa between the end of 1311 and the start of 1312. With or without Dante, by the time Henry arrived in Genoa at the end of October 1311, Florence's opposition to his project had become clear. Over the preceding months, the city had been besieged. Arezzo presented the passage of Louis of Savoy, who was entrusted with preparing the imperial coronation in Rome, and that of 2 ambassadors sent to seek the support of the Tuscan lords and communes for the future emperor. Thanks to pressure from Florence, a number of lords who had sworn fidelity to the emperor returned to the Guelph camp. Among them were the Guido of Batifoli, with whom Dante had stayed. If his visit to Casentino had been part of a mission to promote the imperial alliance, it ended in complete failure. In November of 1311, Henry demanded the commune of Florence come and defend its actions before him. Since no one presented themselves, he declared the banishment of Florence from the empire on Christmas Day. The city was deprived of its jurisdiction, its priors officially declared infamous, and anyone was permitted to capture the Florentines and take their possessions. Essentially an imperial ban. This was a reaction to the maneuvers of his adversaries, who were at the moment achieving incredible success. Angevin troops had occupied Rome in December of 1311. The objective, although not declared, was obvious: to prevent Henry from being crowned. The coronation, the only guarantee of the imperial title, became the Luxembourgers' sole concern, the Luxembourgers being the imperial house of Henry VII, and indeed would play a major part in the history of the Holy Roman Empire across the 14th and the 15th centuries, albeit any sort of reference to the family has been completely and utterly eclipsed in history by the Habsburgs that came to succeed them. Over the following months, Henry VII tried to reach an agreement with the Angevins, but at the same time sought an ally for a potential war by entering into contact with King Frederick III of Sicily, brother of the King of Aragon, under whose dominion the island had been since its capture from the Angevins, and this would be the Sicilian Vespers. Clement V, still torn between his desire for independence and obedience to the King of France, who supported the Angevins, again reminding us all the aspect that he was stuck in Avignon this entire time, hesitated and reiterated his proposal for a marriage between one of Robert of Anjou's daughters and Henry's son, while reproaching the latter for being too friendly with the enemies of the Church. In the last days of March of 1312, during the Council of Vienne, the Pope finally ceded to the demands of Philip the Fair, King of France, and sent a letter to Henry announcing that he would not order the Angevins to abandon Rome. For the supporters of the King of the Romans, and thus for Dante, who would often refer to it in the Commedia, this was treason. Henry did not give up on his journey to Rome that easily. He arrived in the city in May of 1312, and following 2 months of battles and negotiations, managed to be crowned, although in a manner different to that for which he had hoped. Contrary to tradition, the ceremony took place at the Lateran and not the Vatican, and was celebrated by 3 cardinals, including de Prato, rather than by the Pope. Finally, Emperor, but now at war with the Guelphs, Robert of Anjou, and the part of the papal curia closest to the French crown, Henry VII signed an alliance with Frederick of Sicily against the Angevins. He promised to recognize the son of Frederick as the heir to the kingdom of Sicily. Clement V responded with a letter that imposed a truce between Henry and Robert. This missive reveals a political philosophy opposed to that of the encyclical letter published by the emperor on the 29th of June after his coronation. While the emperor's next text promotes the universality of empire to which all men and powers are subject, the letter of Clement V places the crowned emperor and the King of Naples on the same level, below the Pope. Henry left Rome to fight against the enemies in Tuscany. He besieged Florence for several months, but the numerical inferiority of his troops forced him to retreat, first to Poggibonsi and then to Pisa. Shortly after, the Commune of Florence drew up a list of citizens declared rebels for having participated in the siege. This list includes neither Dante's name or those of any of other Tuscans who supported Henry before or after the siege. In his biography, Leonardo Bruni cites a lost writing, perhaps a letter, in which Dante affirmed that he had not wished to take part in the siege against his own city, comparing to his vitriol and support of Henry to do so a few months earlier. Henry spent the winter of 1312-13 at Pisa, surrounded by jurists favourable to his cause, who wrote memorandums and pamphlets. The aim of this work was to construct a series of arguments in response to those of the defenders of the Pope and King Robert. Pisan Constitutions, a document published by the Emperor in March 1313, defining imperial jurisdiction, were the official product of this work, as well as the legal foundation of the condemnation of Robert of Anjou as a rebel, published shortly afterwards at the end of April 1313. In these texts, and the preparatory works for them, we find many of the ideas evoked by Dante in the 4th treatise of the Convivio, in his letters, and above all in his treatise, the Monarchia. In the last of these, Dante developed 3 theses from which rigorous scholastic principles, the universal empire is necessary for ensuring the best possible outcomes for the human race on earth, the Roman people hold the empire by right, and the authority of the emperor derives directly from God, rather than through the mediation of a minister or vicar of God. The development of this last anti-papal principle was more analytic than his previous works. Moreover, many of the arguments that he used were similar to those produced in Pisa during the winter of 1312. This fact, among others, suggests that the conception and composition of Monarchia happened at this time. A passage in which Dante complains in the present tense that the only thing that unites the lords of the land is opposition to the emperor seems to confirm that at least a part of his work was composed during the expedition of Henry VII, who, anticlimactically, died in 1313. However, this chronology is far from being unanimously accepted. So, the actual political program of the empire had temporarily been scuppered. It should be noted that Henry VII, of course, as mentioned in those various families, had elevated allies, and they represented essentially a new Ghibelline political structure across northern Italy. But nevertheless, Dante was not whisked back to Florence, representing some sort of new imperial grand constituency. And essentially what is left to us and what is important for our understanding of Dante and this role of conceptual history is to see how this experience, all of the letters, the convivio, all led to the composition of the Monarchia. And effectively, at this point of culmination, it is apt, essentially, to actually come to analyzing the work. And by the way, this is the Prue translation. I've referenced and included the citation in the description. So again, referring back to the principle of Monarchia, which had already been somewhat elucidated as a result of his various epistles, letters, during the course of Henry VII's expedition, albeit the expedition, as I mentioned, that ended very anticlimactically. And he starts off in terms of temporal definitions. Temporal monarchy, in broad terms, as it is generally understood, temporal monarchy then, which men call empire, is a single sovereign authority set over all others in time. This is to say, over all authorities which operate in those things, and over those things which are measured by time. So it should be noted from here that the Monarchia is divided into 3 books, and the argumentation of the Monarchia is essentially formed around a series of first principles, which he elucidates in Book 1, and then syllogistically takes those, and based on those first premises, constructs various arguments, essentially derived by a sense of deductive reasoning, political theory derived from these principles, having established essentially what he views monarchy as. And to monarchy, which essentially here is synonymous with the use of empire, dominus mundi, the lord of the world, we come to the next central component in terms of understanding Monarchia, which is unity. Whatever constitutes the purpose of the whole of human society, if there is such a purpose, will be here the first principle, in terms of which all subsequent propositions to be proved will be demonstrated with sufficient rigor. For it will be foolish to suppose that there is one purpose for this society and another for that, and not a common purpose for all of them. There is, therefore, some activity specific to humanity as a whole, for which the whole human race in all its vast number of individual human beings is designed, and no single person or household, or small community or city or individual can fully achieve it. The activity proper to mankind, considered as a whole, is constantly to actualize the full intellectual potential of humanity, primarily through thought and secondarily through action, as a function and extension of thought. And since what holds true for the part is true for the whole, and an individual human being grows perfect in judgment and wisdom when he sits at rest, it is apparent that mankind most freely and readily attends this activity, an activity which is almost divine, as we read in the Psalms. Thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, in the calm or tranquility of peace. Hence, it is clear that universal peace is the best of those things which are ordained for human happiness. The essence of Dante's thought is universality. And again, it's very difficult to separate this notion from being an essential Catholic theorist, because the essence of unity is also reflected in what he is critiquing, which is the nature and role in the church vis-a-vis temporal authority in the state. Because, of course, Catholics must believe that salvation can only be derived through the church as a heavenly institution which had been consecrated by Christ, and its authority bestowed upon Peter is essentially the rock These elements essentially of salvation through the church are mirrored in his temporal authority as representing a universal dominion over all mankind, which is then subject to the supreme monarchical figurehead, which of course is the emperor. Of course, to think in such terms, even from a perennialist or relativistic view, is almost obscene. But nevertheless, we're talking about a conception of res publica Christiana, the Republic of Christendom, consisting of all of these kingdoms, which at this time would go all the way from Finland in the northeast to Portugal in the south. There is a conception of civilization which is bound up with Christianity, the Christian Union. However, it is thoroughly weak. It is decentralized. And Prue in the introduction actually offers a quite sort of a cogent and succinct explanation of this, which is his principle is mankind considered as totality, has its own functional purpose, a purpose which cannot be fulfilled by any individual, however brilliant, or by any single group or race, however gifted, but only by the whole of humanity considered precisely as a whole. That purpose, it is to realize human intellectual potential, simul in Latin, all at once, and semper, all at the same time. Again, reflecting the idea of the universality of the church and indeed the universality of the res publica Christiana, or the Christian dominion. So moving on. If we consider a household whose purpose is to prepare its members to live the good life, there must be one person who guides and directs, who is called the paterfamilias, or his representative, in line with Aristotle's observation that every household is governed by the eldest, and his role, as Homer says, is to guide everyone and impose rules on the others. Hence the proverbial curse, "May you have an equal in your house." If we consider a small community whose purpose is neighborly, support in relation both to the people and to goods, there must be one person who guides the others, either appointed by someone from outside or emerging as leader from among their number, with the agreement of the others. Otherwise, not only will they fail to achieve the neighborly collaboration, but sometimes, if a number of people contest the leadership, the whole community is destroyed. If we consider a city whose purpose is to be self-sufficient in living the good life, there must be one ruling body, and this is not only in just government, but in perverted forms of government as well. As if this should not be the case, not only is the purpose of social life thwarted, but the city itself ceases to be what it was, the city of God. Lastly, if we consider an individual kingdom, the purpose of a kingdom is the same as that of a city, but with a greater confidence that peace can be maintained. There must be one king who rules and governs otherwise. Not only do those who live in the kingdom not achieve that purpose, but the kingdom itself falls to ruin, in accordance with those words of the infallible truth, "Every kingdom divided against itself shall be laid waste." Or another translation of that, "A house divided cannot stand." If this holds true in these cases, and in individuals who are ordered to one particular goal, then the proposition advanced above is true. Now it is agreed that the whole of mankind is ordered to one goal, as we have already been demonstrating. There must therefore be one person who directs and rules mankind, and he is properly called the monarch, or the emperor. And thus it is apparent that the well-being of the world requires there be a monarch or empire. This, you can't look at this and not take the inspirations or references from the political context at that time. Uh, Essentially, this can be a damning indictment of the horrific sort of political schism, division he found in Italy. And what he does is, from this experience, he takes a principle and establishes an ideal community, i.e., he takes what could be in terms of the political expedition of Henry VII, and he transcends that into the realm of sort of first premises and theory. So Dante is not deluded enough, as we know from his political experience, to actually imagine that this would be the case, but he believes that this ought to be the case in terms of the closest thing to a perfect or temporal unity or body that should be true of all times, even if it can't be realized politically. And Mike Leroy in the chat, who is being incredibly derisive towards my voice. I speak like this all the time, I'm afraid. I don't. It is my voice. I am actually drinking plenty of water, but I will continue regardless, and I won't take your comments about my apparent weak voice to heart. Thank you. So continuing on, going from the idea of the divine household, or rather the monarchical household, I don't really want to actively conflate those terms, I do apologize, to Dante's consideration of the divine order. The human race constitutes a whole in relation to its constituent parts, and is itself a part in relation to a whole. It is a whole in relation to individual kingdoms and peoples, as has been shown, and it is a part in relation to the whole universe. So much is self-evident. And just as the lesser parts which make up the human race are well adapted to it, so too can be described as being well adapted to its whole, for its parts are well adapted to it in relation to a single principle, as can easily be deduced from what was said earlier in these treatises. And so, absolutely speaking, it too is well adapted to the universe, or to its ruler, who is God and monarch, in relation to a single principle, i.e. one ruler. And thus it follows that monarchy is necessary to the well-being of the world. Mankind is most a unity when it is drawn together to form a single entity, and this can only come about when it is ruled as one whole by one ruler, as is self-evident. Therefore mankind is, much like God, when it is ruled by the one ruler, and consequently is most in harmony with God's intention. In terms of considering this idea of harmony with God's intention, and that of monarchy and courtly politics is simply wanting to reflect divine order, which represented in the stars, represented in the cosmos, Astaria. This is actually taken to almost be a metaphor for musical composition. Indeed, the idea of the symphony, that the court essentially be arranged as some sort of grand orchestra. And indeed, this would later be adopted with cameralists to represent the sort of perfect model of clockwork. All of these elements, these symbolic elements, whether it be music to represent court life, or whether it be essentially the perfect form of government via the cameralists in the 18th century, all of this essentially is to represent this absolute principle, which is concord, harmony, temporal authority as being reflection. And indeed, you can't really understand this and say that this hasn't influenced political theory going up all the way up until the French Revolution in the 18th century, as much as people want to wrestle Dante away from this defense essentially of Christian monarchy and as being a superlative representative of medievalism. I don't really want to get into a comparison between Dante and Petrarch here, but it's fair to say that one has been more successfully extradited from the medieval period than Dante. Now coming on to the topic of justice, and again, one doesn't need to overstate how much justice was playing on Dante's mind in the context of his exile. The world is ordered in the best possible way when justice is at its strongest in it. Thus Virgil, wishing to praise the age which seems to be emerging in his day, sang in the Eclogues, "Now the Virgin returns, the reign of Saturn returns." For the Virgin was the ancient name for justice, whom they also called Asteria, the reign of Saturn, was their name for the best of times, which they also called the Golden Age. Justice is at its strongest only under a monarch. Therefore, for the best ordering of the world, there must be a monarchy or empire. To clarify the minor premise, it must be understood that justice considered in itself and in its own nature is a kind of rectitude or rule, which spurns deviation from the straight path to either side, and thus it does not admit of a more and less, just like the whiteness considered in the abstract. There are forms of this kind, in fact, which are to be found in composites, but which in themselves consist of a simple and unchangeable essence. The master of six principles. Such qualities are present to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the subjects in which they are given concrete form, according as these subjects contain more or less of their opposites. Therefore, justice is at its strongest, where there is least of what is opposed to justice, both in the disposition and in the actions of an agent, when then truly it can be said of her, as Aristotle says, neither Hesperus nor Lucifer is so wondrous. For she is then like Phoebe gazing across the heavens at her brother from the rosy flush of the clear morning sky, from a point on the horizon diametrically opposite. As far as disposition is concerned, justice is sometimes impeded in the will, for where the will is not entirely free of all greed, even if justice is present, nonetheless it is not entirely present in the splendour of its purity, for the subject has something, however slight, which is in some way resistant to it, and thus is why those who try to stir up the judge's emotions are rightly rebuffed. As far as actions are concerned, justice is sometimes impeded with regard to power, for since justice is a virtue that operates in relation to other people, if someone does not have the power to give to each person what is, how will he act in accordance with justice? From this it is clear that the more powerful a just man is, the more effective will justice be brought about by his actions. I think living in today's age, there is something which rings intrinsically true, especially for me, albeit you can easily sort of draw some perversion of that. Justice as severe, inflexible, virtue essentially without terror as impotence. Calling on some sort of absolute statism, but Dante isn't doing that, and indeed he will elucidate on the idea of freedom. Here, justice is essentially represented in the supreme monarch, essentially, who can hold his underlings to account. And this isn't some fantasy, as it may imply. In fact, this was following along with historical developments at that time. Even though Florence and Dante, you can say, is a victim of the Capetian dynasty, the Angevins, Philip IV, and the aligned papacy, it's also clear that the developments in Italy, indeed Dante's own sort of transition to the vernacular, was following in terms of developments in France. But the most crucial development in France here is the institution of royal justice, that the king, in this instance, it would have been Philip IV's grandfather, Louis IX of France, Saint Louis, establishes his Council of the Realm, the Council de Roi, and along with what later be the institutions of the Paris Parlement, and the centralization, effectively, of royal justice, the establishment of a universal body through which to judge, effectively, you can say, an imitation of the Roman Senate, the centralization of justice to essentially eliminate robber barons, the misuses of feudalism, to allow individuals the right to petition the king directly, and for the king then to have the ability to execute justice. Indeed, you can almost say that Saint Louis, contrary to, you can say, the aspirations or the denied aspirations of the Emperor Henry VII, is, you can say, the more pure incarnation of this ideal which Dante here is about to set forth. And again, within the context of this, Louis IX had only died some 40 years before, so all of these events and these precedents would have weighed heavily, essentially, on the medieval mindset, that this isn't an idea purely in the abstract, but this is something which, like the abortive project of Henry VII, had attempted to be actualized in terms of a coherent political formula. Albeit we must look at Saint Louis and say he is some sort of a saved exception within this scheme. And indeed, This has echoes of what would later be the arguments for royal absolutism. Indeed, this idea of a defense for monarchy, a defense for empire, which is born out of scripture, which he references alongside with his classical authorities, it to me is almost a prelude to what we see with Bossuet. You can say that the idea of French absolutism and the centralization of royal justice, as I begin in France with Saint Louis, really culminates in Louis XIV, and it's actually something I want to return to at the end. So moving on from justice, we come to the topic of Dantean freedom. Now, the human race is in its ideal state when it is completely free. This will be clear if we clarify what freedom is, or the principle of freedom. I don't want to paraphrase and change Dante if I can, albeit this is still a translation, obviously. Therefore, it must be borne in mind that the first principle of our freedom is free will, and again, a divinely ordained principle, which many people talk about but few understand, for they go so far as to say that free will is free judgment in matters of volition. And what they say is true, but they are very far from understanding what the words mean, just like our logicians who daily enunciate clear propositions by way of example and discursive of logic, such as the triangle has 3 angles equal to 2 right angles. And therefore I say the judgment is the link between perception and appetition. For first a thing is perceived, then it is judged to be good or evil, and finally the person who judges pursues it or shuns it. Now, if judgment controls desire completely and is in no way preempted by it, it is free. But if judgment is in a way at all preempted and thus controlled by desire, it cannot be free, because it does not act under its own power, but is dragged along in the power of something else. And that is why the lower animals cannot have free will, because their judgments are always preempted by desire. And from this it is also clear that non-material beings whose wills are unchangeable, as well as human souls, will leave this world of ours in a state of grace, do not lose free will on account of the fact that their wills are unchangeable. In fact, they return it in its most perfect and true form. This isn't synonymous with sin, which of course Dante would recognize sin as representing its own slavery. But in the animal, there's no sort of impetus to do wrong, which is in some way self-aware here. It is simply the result of base principles, hence why animals cannot be considered essentially to be proper receptacles for grace within the Christian viewpoint. When this has been grasped, it can also be seen that this freedom, for this principle of all our freedom, is the greatest gift given by God to human nature, as I have already said in the Paradiso, the comedy, since by virtue of it we become happy. Here as men, by virtue of it, we become happy elsewhere as gods. If this is the case, who will not agree that the human race is at best when it is able to make fullest use of this principle? But living under a monarch, it is supremely free. Thus, it must be borne in mind that a thing which is free, which exists for its own sake, and not for the sake of something else, as Aristotle states in the Metaphysics. For a thing which exists for the sake of something else is necessarily conditioned by that other for which sake it exists, as a root is necessarily conditioned by its terminus, i.e. teleological. Mankind exists for its own sake, and not for the sake of something else, only when it is under the rule of a monarch. For only then are perverted forms of government, i.e. democracies, oligarchies, tyrannies. I will notice that a couple of translations change democracy to mob rule, but it's very clear in terms of Aristotle's conception, which Dante is borrowing here, that they do mean democracy as a tyrannical form or perverted form of government, which is true. But nevertheless, I just want to focus on this idea of happiness, because this received a huge amount of pushback at the time, particularly from one Guido Vernani, who was a papal apologist, specifically for the idea that it essentially robbed the church of the idea that all supreme happiness is essentially achieved through salvation of the church. But nevertheless, it's clear that Dante isn't trying to usurp that role, albeit you can say an incredibly harsh interpretation would sort of arrive at that. All right. The perverted forms of government which force mankind into slavery. set right as is clear to anyone who examines them all, and only then do kings, aristocrats, known as the great and the good, and those zealous for the freedom of the people, govern justly. For since the monarch loves men most, as we have already noted, and again, this is Dante is not thinking historically, he's thinking from first principles, so as to try and understand how he's able to deduce such arguments essentially from his own established logic. He wants all men to become good, and this cannot happen under perverted forms of government. Hence Aristotle in the Politics says that in bad government the good man is a bad citizen, whereas in a good government the good man and the good citizen are one and the same thing. And again, that notion always really sticks out to me and again rings so true. In a bad government, the good man is a bad citizen. These just forms of government aim at freedom, i.e. that man should exist for their own sake. And you can say that allowing for free will, allowing for proper volition, is beyond the sake of earthly happiness. If I were to take into account the Christian sort of papal apologist admonition of this, but again, it's the purest state of temporal affairs which allow for the salvation of mankind through the essentially the saving of souls. Just a quick note, Duke Valentino. Columba has sort of moved on from YouTube, unfortunately. That's all I'm really going to talk about it in terms of people, of course, who would want Columba to come back and contribute. Indeed, it would be very appropriate for Columba to contribute to this because he is probably as a bigger fan of Dante as I. And just as these forms of government aim at freedom, that men should exist for their own sake, for citizens do not exist for the sake of consuls, nor the people for the sake of a king, but on the contrary, consuls exist for the sake of the citizens and the kings for the people. For just as a political community is not formed for the sake of laws, but laws are framed for the benefit of the political community, in the same way that those lives are governed by law are not there for the sake of the legislator, but rather he is there for the sake, as Aristotle says in those writings he has left to us on the subject. Thus it is apparent that although a consul or a king are masters over others with respect to means, with respect to ends, they are the servant of others, and this is especially true of the monarch, who is considered without a doubt to be the servant of all men. One can obviously take this and mislabel it and apply some sort of modern or secular applications to this as the first citizen or the essentially the first citizen of state, which you can probably apply this to the role of American presidents, but that isn't obviously what Dante is trying to get here. He's not advocating for some republican form of monarchy, but he is, but not necessarily in the way that you would lazily come to that conclusion, but rather emphasis on consul and king, emphasis on his Latin authorities, and consider that rather than looking at someone like Diocletian and the role of monarchy, since that dominus et deus, master and God, albeit again that whole idea is being recontextualized radically by Christian monarchy, he is looking at Christian monarchy, yet he is also looking back to Rome. He is looking back to the authority, essentially, of the Roman princeps. And specifically regarding to Virgil, he's looking to Caesar and Augustus, and he sees the principate as a form of government where the monarch, in this case the imperator, the emperor, is the first servant, essentially, or the first citizen of the state. So there is a deeply classical element here, which is infused in this notion of classical kingship. But indeed, as the king is represented as the head of a household, a tribe, a paterfamilias, so he is also the father, he is also responsible for the well-being of his children. So in terms of the biblical aspects of this, in terms of the historical allusions which he's drawing to, but also in terms of wedding this down to a very sort of concrete and recognizable familiar aspect. All of these ideas are conducive to the idea that the king is a servant of the people and the monarch who is emperor is the servant of all. And this idea feeds into the idea of unity. And the last point which I want to end off in terms of book one, which is the idea of concordia. Consider the nature of meaning of concord. For concord is a uniform movement of several wills, From this definition, it is clear that unity of wills, which is what is from the definition, it is clear that unity of wills, which is signified by uniform movement, is the root of concord, or indeed is concord itself. For just as we would describe a number of clods of earth as being in concord because of their all falling towards the centre of the world, and a number of flames as in concord because of their all rising towards its circumference, if they did this of their own free will, in the same way we describe a number of people as being in concord when they move all together and of their own free will towards one thing, which in their wills, formerly, just as there is one quality, heaviness, formerly in the clods of the earth, and another lightness in the flames, for the capacity to will is a potentiality, and its form is the image of good which is perceived, and this form, just like other forms, is one in itself, and becomes multiple, according to the multiplicity of the material which receives it, just like soul, number, and other forms which are found in composites. All concord depends on the unity which is in wills. Mankind, in its ideal state, represents a kind of concord, for just as one man, in his ideal state, spiritually and physically, is a kind of concord, and the same holds true of every household, a city, and a kingdom, so is the whole of mankind. Thus the whole of mankind in its ideal state depends on the unity which is men's wills. But this cannot be unless there is one will which controls and directs all the others towards one goal, since the wills of mortals require guidance on account of the seductive pleasures of youth, as Aristotle teaches in the Ethics. Nor can such a single will exist unless there is one ruler who rules over everyone, whose will can control and guide all other wills. Now, if all the above conclusions are true, as they are, for mankind to be in its ideal state, there must be a monarch in the world, and consequently, the well-being of the world requires monarchy. All the arguments advanced so far, confirmed by remarkable historical fact. I really want to get into the role of Dante as a historian here, namely the state of humanity, which is the Son of God, either awaited or himself chose to bring about when he was on the point of becoming man for the salvation of mankind. For if we review the ages and the dispositions of men from the fall of our first parents, which was the turning point at which we went astray, we shall not find there ever was peace throughout the world, except under the immortal Augustus. Then a perfect monarchy existed. That mankind was then happy in the calm of universal peace is attested to by all historians and by famous poets. Even the chronicler of Christ's gentleness deigned to bear witness to it. And finally Paul called the most happy state the fullness of time. Truly that time was full, as were all temporal things, for no ministry to our happiness lacked its minister. What the state of the world has been since the seamless garment was the first rent by the talon of cupidity we can read about, would that we might not witness it. O human race, how many storms and misfortunes and shipwrecks must toss you about a while, transformed into a many-headed beast. You strive after conflicting things. You are sick in your intellects, both of them, and in your afflictions, but do not nurture your higher intellect in inviolable principles, not your lower intellect with these lessons of experience, nor your affections with the sweetness of divine counsel, which is breathed into you by the trumpet of the Holy Spirit. Behold now how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell and live together. Now, as you can probably guess by the idea of the supreme will which guides and coordinates all other wills, if one is to assume Dante's ideas in the abstract, this of course could lead to the best possible form of government, or the very worst. And the reason why he alludes to the best is in the idea essentially which is Christian, which is all wills together in concord, aspiring to salvation, aspiring to heaven. This is not obviously to say that the emperor is the source of salvation, but the emperor merely guides and is allowed to facilitate that. And of course, it's obvious sort of reading this, and he is directly referenced, Dante has directly referenced Aristotle many times, that implicit in the argument of the De Monarchia is the idea of politics essentially is the master science from which all other good can essentially derive, if you're able to find that correct political formula from which this can all be derived. And of course, he tries to find a historical analogy, which, again, many of you may draw that conclusion that Augustus was perhaps the greatest monarch in the history of Western civilization. Of course, without qualification, which Dante obviously will give, that idea can seem to be a very sort of classically romantic notion, but it can also be seen as blasphemy, of course, because Augustus was not a Christian. And this leads, as we saw with his conception of Augustus, into the argument of Book 2, which leans very heavily on his classical sources. But in terms of trying to look at precedents for this, because although Dante himself directly says that he aspires to originality, he is nevertheless the product of the medieval context in which he finds himself. This picture is Charon's Tiburtine Sibyl, and this, you can say, is the conclusion of a series of legends compiled in the quote-unquote Golden Legend, a series of works from the medieval ages, which roughly attributed to the first half of the 13th century, so again, near contemporary to Dante. And as part of the Golden Legend, there is the chronicle of a legendary meeting between Augustus and the Tiburtine Sibyl. According to the story, Augustus is asking the Sibyl whether essentially he should be worshipped as a god. And of course, the whole, you can say, legitimacy of what historians would call the Julian-Claudian dynasty was the basis that Julius Caesar, again, Virgil, the Aeneid, obviously Dante is aware and using this essentially as an argument, is the descendant of Venus Genetrix. And when Caesar dies, he is deified by the Senate. So Augustus here, in this fictional Christian setting, is considered the implications of being deified. And in response to asking this question to the Sibyl reveals to Augustus a vision of the Virgin and the Christ child who will eclipse the Roman gods. So in a case, Augustus is doubting and considering his role essentially of the deified Augustus, which he will become in terms of Roman history. But it is also an illusion that whatever aspirations Augustus has to his own sense of divinity will ultimately be superseded, the eclipse of all, by the culmination of the arrival of Christ, his redemptive act, and indeed the whole sort of incarnation of the of Christ, but also as a composite of a component of the Holy Trinity. All of these elements essentially demonstrate that there is an attempt within medieval legends, mythology, you can even say historiography, to link Augustus in terms of the grand scheme of sort of political treatise and literature, and indeed the emphasis on Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire. And this isn't just, of course, a reference to Monarchia. He is the good Augustus, according to Virgil, in Dante's Paradiso in Purgatory. Indeed, apparently, according to Purgatorio, Virgil is responsible for the physical and literary remains. And of course, those of you who, in sort of a bygone era now, watch the Aeneid stream, the Virgil stream, know, of course, that the Aeneid was, of course, patronized indirectly by Augustus. So to say again that this featured prominently in Dante's sort of overall sort of scheme of the world is cannot be overstated. So finally, coming to Book 2, he begins very provocatively, albeit it's already alluded to in the segment I read from Brilli. I, Dante, therefore affirm that it was by right and not by usurping that the Roman people took on the office of the monarch, which is called the empire over all men. This can be proved firstly as follows. It is appropriate that the noblest race should rule over all others. The Roman people were the noblest, therefore it is appropriate that they should rule over all others. In terms of trying to contextualize this, what Dante is really getting at here, he of course is taking on this notion of concordia. He's taking on this aspect of the unity of races. And in terms of trying to justify the supremacy of Roman civilization, it is historically self-evident to him. He considers this the Romans winning the race to empire, winning the race of civilizations. And against this, he uses mythological and historical sources dating back to the Assyrian Empire, the Egyptians, and also Alexander, who was mere a preamble to the Roman Empire. And you can see such sort of apologists and transitory intellectual figures such as Polybius accepting, you can say, the nobility of the Romans against the perfidy of the Greeks in the 3rd century. For Dante, temporal power is made manifest in the divine will of God. And essentially, he views history, his whole scheme of history as revelation, is to see the Romans winning essentially the battle of history as if it were all trial by combat. And it is the trial of combat that allows essentially the Roman Empire to claim that the empire is in fact established by divine right. This, of course, you can't, it is both deeply classical and yet is intrinsically Christian. He is trying to understand the whole context of Roman history and how it relates essentially as an anticipation of Christian monarchy, and considers this essentially to be the unraveling of divine providence. Indeed, the victorious cause pleases the gods. And of course, to any Catholic, it goes without saying that you need to believe in miracles. And so miracles, as with Dante's deeply Christian conception, form a fundamental part in terms of trying to understand this idea of Roman Empire as exhibiting and possessing the right. Whatever is brought to full realization with the aid of miracles is willed by God, and consequently comes about by right. And it is clear that this is true because, as Thomas Aquinas says in his 3rd book, Contra Gentiles, a miracle is something done by divine intervention outside the normal order in our created world. And thus he proves that only God has the power to perform miracles. And this is corroborated by the authority of Moses, where he tells how, when confronted with gnats, Pharaoh's magicians, using natural principles in their service of their arts and failing, said, "This is the finger of God." Now, if a miracle is a direct action by the first cause without the mediation of secondary agents, as Thomas Aquinas himself proves with sufficient rigor in the book just cited, then when a portent takes place in favor of something, it is wicked to say that the thing so favored is not ordained by God as something pleasing to him. It is therefore holy to acknowledge the converse. The Roman Empire was aided by the help of miracles to achieve supremacy. Therefore, it was willed by God, and consequently, it was and is founded on right. Essentially, God rewarding agents, certain agents through history. And any such failing, you can say, for example, the failing of the First Crusade, which would have been, and the Crusades in general, which had been 100 years essentially before Dante was writing to Monarchia, was in itself a demonstration of Christian licentiousness. It was a form of divine wrath which had been visited on the Christians for not being virtuous enough, for having forsaken essentially the mandate of heaven, divine will as manifest in history through the concept of miracles. This definition correctly embraces the essence and the purpose of historical and divine right. If the goal of any society is the common good of its members, it necessarily follows that the purpose of every right is the common good, and it is impossible that there can be a right which does not aim at the common good. Hence Cicero is correct when he says in De Inventione that laws are always to be interpreted for the benefit of the community. For if laws are not framed for the benefit of those who are subject to the law, they are laws in name only. But in reality, they cannot be laws, for law must bind men together for their mutual benefit. For this reason, Seneca speaks appositely of the law when he says, Decatur virtutibus, that law is the bond of human society. Thus, it is clear that whoever has the common good of community as his goal has the achievement of right as his goal. Therefore, if the Romans had the good of the community as their goal, it will be true to say that the achievement of right was their goal. That the Roman people in conquering the world did have the good of which we have spoken, as their goal is shown by their deeds, for having repressed all greed, which is always harmful to the community, and cherishing universal peace and freedom. That holy, dutiful, and glorious people can be seen to have disregarded personal advantage in order to promote the public interest for the benefit of mankind. Thus, with good reason, it was written, the Roman Empire is born of the fountainhead of piety, pietas. Of course, I don't think you can find a sort of grander exposition of sort of Roman apologetics here. But notice his emphasis on the law and being good on the community and good of the community. In terms of Christian civilization, you can say that what Christian monarchy essentially inherits, and this is even after the reign of Augustus, especially in the law code of the Emperor Justinian, is the corpus of law, the body of law, which would essentially relate to the idea of constitutionalism. But again, going back to this idea that a law that is not for the benefit of the community is not a law at all. Law has to be just. Law has to be a manifestation of the justice of the monarchy, who, of course, reigns supreme over all and is the embodiment of justice. In the same way that Rome claimed to have universality, Rome claimed to have administration over all. Augustus was, in a sense, the most powerful arbiter of this. Then essentially follows that the corpus of Roman law was right and just, and for the benefit of the community, if we accept Dante's arguments on the basis of first principles. I want to make a note on history, because I think it can't really be resisted now. Because Dante is no Vico, Giambattista Vico, who historians owe so much, essentially, in terms of theory. I bring up Vico specifically, of course, because the New Science, of course, was a work of historical sort of philosophy written essentially as a Roman history. Because Dante combines historical sources, but also myth, or mythic history, as he would compare, liberally comparing various allegories, Virgil's poetry in the Aeneid, a form of scriptural exegesis, and of course, iconic, then considered authoritative historical works of Livy, and the writings of Cicero. And he uses these as his authorities. He doesn't exactly employ the Socratic method to interrogate the validity of his sources here. And indeed, it actually catches him up when not only does he not question his authorities, but uses it essentially to demonstrate his arguments from, being historically contingent, which conform with his ideas of first principles. On the one hand, he is creating a political treatise which transcends and is supposed to be true of all times. Yet he's also trying to justify the fact, justify the fact after the fact, by declaring that these arguments have essentially been made historically manifest. All of this is very interesting in terms of understanding the medieval mindset before we get to the modern discipline of history, which is, you can say, fundamentally sympathetic as it is relativistic. And indeed, despite being a Catholic, I will come out and say that I do not see the will of God made manifest in events. I do not attempt to interpret any sort of divine revelation through events, which is intrinsic to the medieval mindset. You can say that people living the medieval period did not see themselves almost living historically, but they saw themselves essentially living within this whole conception of, again, unity, the church, timelessness, and such as the time exists, it is eschatology. It is the time waiting for the end of the world when Christ comes and establishes his kingdom on earth, the end of history. So again, interesting insight in terms of how Dante aspires to both being a theologian, a political theorist, and historian, but I think conclusively fails in his endeavor to be a historian. But nevertheless, so focusing on this idea of the right, Now nature is no less provident than this in the ordering of things. From this, it is clear that nature orders things according to their capacities, and this taking into account of their capacities is the basis of right established by nature in the created world. From this it follows that the natural order in created world cannot be maintained without right, since the basis of right is inseparably bound up with that order. The preservation of that order is therefore necessarily right. The Roman people were ordained by nature to rule, and this can be shown as follows. Just as a craftsman would never achieve artistic perfection if he aimed only at the final form, and paid no heed to the means by which the form was to be achieved, so too nature would fail if it aimed only at the universal form of divine likeness in the universe, yet neglected the means to achieve it. But nature is nevertheless never less than perfect, since it is the work of divine intelligence. Therefore it wills all the means through which it achieves the fulfilling of its intention. Since therefore the goal of the human race is itself a necessary means to achieving the universal goal of nature, it is necessary that nature wills it. An implicit understanding of natural rights, effectively. And natural right is not here, you can say, as some sort of grand secular impulse is derived effectively. Well, I'm not going to say that Locke was superseding a divine right when he was thinking of the idea of natural rights and informing later 18th century, specifically Anglophone 18th century political thought. But here, natural right is essentially held up to be a parallel divine right. Divine right, of course, may manifest in the fact that nature is a result of creation. Nature is essentially a result of intelligence, and thereby the natural world and natural right always means to imitate divine order because it was divinely ordained in the first place. But nevertheless, this isn't, again, a form of usurpation, but this is more a conception of temporal authority attempting and always reflecting a harmony which is mirrored in the heavens. I actually wanted to start off with this, but I forgot to mention this at the beginning. But nevertheless, I think it's an interesting quote from the Aeneid, which Dante draws in terms of trying to illustrate the overall sort of crux of his argument. That others shall beat out the breathing bronze more delicately, I can well believe, and draw forth living creatures from the marble. Plead causes better, trace movements of the heavens, with pointers tell the rising of the stars. Roman, remember to rule over nations. Your art shall be to impose the ways of peace, spare subject peoples, and subdue the proud. And again, yes, and someone's mentioning man conquering nature. No, it is natural right, which essentially is made manifest in the harmony of nature in accordance with some overall divine plan. The idea of mankind conquering nature or usurping nature effectively is trying to master creation, as opposed to trying to live in accordance with creation. Yes, man is granted dominion, but dominion over nature essentially is supposed to be in accordance with the original divine intention. Is not meant to represent a usurpation. So all of this is, again, to qualify that Dante is always sort of walking a very fine line, but in my view, never crossing it. But I think you can understand from listening to this why so many characters from the 14th century were so willing to consider Dante to be a heretic, wanted, say, for example, to desecrate his remains, wanted to burn his books. And indeed, this book, of course, would find itself on the index of prohibited works in the 16th century. It is clear that the Roman people acquired the empire through trial by combat, therefore is acquired by right, which is our main thesis. If the Roman Empire was not based on right, and this is a fundamental point in terms of trying to understand the authority of the Roman Empire vis-a-vis the Church. If the Roman Empire was not based on right, Christ by his birth assented to an injustice. The consequent is false, therefore the contradictory of the antecedent is true. For contradictory statements are mutually exclusive. If one is false, the other must be true. There is no need to demonstrate to believers that the consequent is false, for if someone is a believer, He allows that this is false. If he does not allow it, he is not a believer. And if he is not a believer, this argument is not made for him. I shall show the relationship of this consequentiality as follows. Anyone who of his own free will complies with an edict acknowledges by his action that the edict is legitimate. And since actions are more telling than words, as Aristotle says at the end of the Ethics, he does so more effectively than if he gave its verbal approval. So, legitimacy, consenting to be judged by a properly constituted authority. This is why I began this talk by focusing so much on the exile, because, again, I hate to psychoanalyze Dante, but the idea of presenting oneself before a legitimate authority, it is the idea that not only is one judged, but one is consented to be judged, harkening back to Aristotle and the idea that a good man operating within a tyrannical or a bad government is necessarily a bad citizen because he does not consent to the legitimacy of the regime which he considers tyrannical or bad. And to do so, you can almost say, is to weaken, you can say almost morally dismember that person because he has consented to a legitimacy which is fundamentally illegitimate. Christ chose to be born of his virgin mother under the edict emanating from Roman authority, so that the Son of God made man might be enrolled as a man in the unique census of the human race. This means that he acknowledged the validity of that edict. And perhaps it is more holy to believe that the edict came by divine inspiration through Caesar, so that he who had been so long awaited in the society of men might himself be enrolled among the mortals. Therefore Christ acknowledged by his actions that the edict of the Augustus, who embodied the authority of the Romans, was legitimate. And since someone who issues an edict legitimately must logically have the jurisdiction to do so, it necessarily follows that someone who acknowledges that an edict is legitimate is also acknowledging that the jurisdiction of the authority which promulgated it is legitimate. Because if it were not based on right, it would not be legitimate. And note that our argument, Dante interestingly referring to himself in the plural, which is based on denying the consequent, although valid in its form by virtue of a commonplace, yet reveals its full force as a second figure syllogism, if it is then reduced to the first figure as an argument based on affirming the consequent. This reduction runs as follows. All injustice is assented to unjustly. Christ did not assent unjustly. Therefore, he did not assent to an injustice, affirming the consequent. We get all injustice is assented to unjustly. Christ assented to an injustice. Therefore, he assented unjustly. This is false. Therefore, the contradictory, and if the Roman Empire was not based on right, Adam's sin was not punished by Christ. It must be borne in mind that punishment is not simply a penalty imposed on one who does wrong, but a penalty imposed on the wrongdoer by one who has the legal authority to punish him. So that if the penalty is not imposed by an authorized judge, it is not a punishment, but is more accurately termed a wrong. Hence the man said to Moses, "Who appointed you to judge over us?" Thus, if Christ had not suffered under an authorized judge, that penalty would not have been a punishment, and no judge could be authorized unless he had jurisdiction over the whole of mankind, since the whole of mankind was punished in the flesh of Christ, who bore our sorrows, as the prophet says. And Tiberius Caesar, whose representative Pilate was, would not have jurisdiction over the whole of mankind unless the Roman Empire had existed and was constituted by right. Christ effectively has been received into the world through the perfection of the Augustinian Roman Empire. You can say that the Roman Empire was the most perfect incarnation, according to Dante, of a temporal pre-Christian government, and that because of this government had the most legitimate authority to carry out the punishment on Christ as man for the original sin of Adam. Effectively, it's setting up a certain order of events where Augustus essentially allows for the temporal conditions to be established to allow Christ to enter. And thus, you can say, according to Dante, that Christ's incarnation and later Christ's crucifixion was in a way as a means to legitimate the temporal authority which would be subsumed into Christianity and become Christian monarchy under Constantine, but more appropriately to say it was confirmed properly under the Emperor Theodosius the Great. Now, something to really emphasize here is probably looking back to the Creed, to the Nicene Creed, and the fact there is emphasis drawn to the fact that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. No doubt Dante would look to the Nicene Creed and focus on this element and say that the fact that this occurred under Pilate again is an implicit understanding of the justly constituted authority. Notice how he doesn't consider the Sanhedrin, and he doesn't consider the Herodian government. He doesn't consider the Israeli Jewish client state in his scheme at all. Indeed, when looking to Herod as an example, Herod represents in many ways the antithesis of this. And the way he can essentially, Dante, can move beyond the injustice and the wrong of the Herodian regime is basically to say that the universal monarch, not Herod as representing some minor client king, but the universal monarch in this case would have been Augustus. Oh, it's not, again, the eccentric trip, but Tiberius is not the pinnacle of Roman justice, obviously. I mean, you just have to look to Sejanus and his antics on Capri to emphasize that. The emphasis really is on Augustus, taken through his authority here, which is Virgil. And Tiberius, it's not justice as representing the person of Tiberius, which I think is fair to say is a pretty deplorable person, but the legitimate authority which he represented, which is the idea of the Roman Imperium as representing the most legitimate form of pre-Christian government. There was also another note, and unfortunately I can't belabor this too much because it really is tangential, but coming back to this idea of the Translatio Imperii, people who've watched my video on the Holy Roman Empire will understand this, that the Roman Empire, according to the traditional sort of Holy Roman interpretation, goes through a series of successive stages. What began as the Roman Empire essentially was bequeathed through the intercession of Leo III to Charlemagne, and thereby essentially a link was maintained whereby the Holy Roman Empire was created essentially based on the female emperorship of Irene in the East, which was a way to disqualify it, even though there had been a series of cultural and religious and political reasons as to why the Pope decided to look for a new protector. This is all very interesting because one, Cary J. Nederman, has brought up in an article which I've included in the further reading, which is Dante's Imperial Road leads to Constantinople. Because theoretically, again, this whole argument pertains to the continuity of Roman civilization. And you can say that this whole idea of Rome as an enduring entity would actually lead itself away from the papal consecration of the Holy Roman Empire and the acknowledgement of the donation of Pepin, which again confirms the papal states which Dante is opposed to, but rather the true Roman ideal, despite again representing now a different variation post-schism of Christianity, the Orthodox Church, is actually to be held still by the Roman Empire, which, even though we have 1204 and we have the destruction of Constantinople, there is still a Byzantine Empire existing under the Paleologus dynasty. And just to summarize, reading the abstract of this article before I move on, Dante's Monarchia is an enigmatic contribution to the corpus of medieval political theory. However, this quintessential statement of the principles of universal imperial authority do not conform to the standard defenses, in Latin defenses of the supremacy of the Roman Empire, for instance, eschewing the theme of Translatio Imperii. So this again is actually to push back on Brilli and push back on the legal justifications and influences behind, you can say, the claims of Henry VII in his expedition to Italy, but rather Dante, in terms of his pure sort of theoretical conception of the ideal form of unity and concord founded on the nobility of the Roman race, actually transcends the traditional apologetics referring to the Ghibelline ideal. because if one looks to the donation of Constantine, which I'll refer to later, the logic here is the legitimacy of the universal Roman Empire does not reside with the German Holy Roman Emperor, because the authority of the Roman Empire was never translated, and imperial authority can never be alienated, such as with the admonition against the donation of Constantine. For people who are interested more in that article, I've included it in the extended reading. So we finally get to the most controversial element of all, which is Book 3. In addition to all of the political developments, Dante was clearly writing this in response to a electric sort of codification of hierocracy and the defense of the temporal prerogatives of the Pope, which is Pope Boniface VIII, despite his ignominious and scandalous death, which I think you more refer to as murdered by agents of Philip IV. And this is the papal encyclical Unam Sanctam. And Dante is going to be referencing this in terms of his argument against papal apologists. Urged by faith, we are obliged to believe and to maintain that the Church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Again, Nicene Creed. We believe in her firmly, and we confess with simplicity that outside of her there is neither salvation nor the remission of sins, as the spouse of the Canticles proclaims. One is my dove, my perfect one. She is the only one, the chosen of her who bore her. And she represents one sole mystical body whose head is Christ, and the head of Christ is God. In her then is one Lord, one faith, one baptism. There had been, at the time of the deluge, only one ark of Noah, prefiguring the one church, which ark, having been finished to a single cubit, had only one pilot and guide, Noah. And we read that outside of this ark, all that substituted on earth was destroyed. We venerate this church as one, the Lord having said by the mouth of the prophet, Deliver, O God, my soul from the sword, and my only from the hand of the dog. He has prayed for his soul, that is for himself, heart and body, and this body, that is to say the church, for his soul, that is for himself, heart and body, and this body, that is to say the church, he has called one because of the unity of the spouse of faith, of the sacraments, and of the charity of the church. This is the tunic of the Lord, the seamless tunic, which was not rent, but was cast by lot. Therefore the one and only church there is, one body, one head, not two heads like a monster, that is Christ and vicar of Christ. Peter and the successor of Peter, since the Lord speaking to Peter himself, feed my sheep, meaning my sheep in general, not these, nor those particular, whence we understand that he entrusted all to him, to Peter. Now, again, to those who look to some sort of secular precedent for Dante, the interesting thing here is not the idea that the Pope necessarily should conform to the temporal domain of an emperor who is a secular ruler, but obviously echoing the universalist conceptions of Dante and Dante responding to this. The admonition you could say against Dante is that Dante was rather wanting the emperor to take on more of the appearance of a pope, going back to Unam Sanctam. Therefore, if the Greeks or others just say that they are not confined to Peter and to his successors, they must confess not being the sheep of Christ, since our Lord says in John, there is one sheepfold and one shepherd. We are informed by the text of the Gospels that in this church and in its power are two swords, namely the spiritual and temporal, for which the apostles say, Behold, here are two swords. That is to say, in the church, since the apostles were speaking, the Lord did not reply that there were too many, but sufficient. Certainly the one who denies that the temporal sword is the power of Peter has not listened well to the word of the Lord commanding, Put up thy sword into thy scabbard. Therefore, both are in the power of the church, namely the spiritual sword and the material. But indeed the latter is to be exercised on behalf of the church, and truly the former is to be exercised by the church. The former is of the priest, and the latter is by the hand of kings and soldiers, but at the will and sufferance of the priest. However, one ought to be subordinated to the other, and temporal authority subjected to spiritual power, for since the apostle said, there is no power except from God, and the things there are ordained by God. But they would not be ordained if one sword were not subordinated to the other, and if the inferior one, as it were were not led upwards by the other. For according to the blessed Dionysius, it is a law of divinity that the lowest things reach the highest places by intermediaries. Then, according to the order of the universe, all things are not led back order equally and immediately, but the lowest by the intermediary and inferior by the superior. Hence we must recognize clearly that spiritual power surpasses in dignity and in ability any temporal power, whatever as spiritual things surpass the temporal. This we see very clearly also by the payment, benediction, and consecration of the tithes, by the acceptance of power itself, and by the government even of things, for which truth is our witness it belongs to spiritual power to establish the terrestrial power, and to pass judgment of it that has not been good. Thus it accomplished the prophecy of Jeremiah concerning the kingdom and the ecclesiastical power. Behold, today I have placed you over nations and over kingdoms and the rest. Therefore, if the terrestrial power err, it will be judged by the spiritual power. But if a minor spiritual power err, it will be judged by a superior spiritual power. But if the highest power of all err, it can be judged only by God and not by man. According to the testimony of the apostle, the spiritual man judgeth of all things, and he himself is judged by no man. This authority, however, is not human, but rather divine, granted to Peter by a divine word and reaffirmed to him and his successors by the one whom Peter confessed, the Lord saying to Peter himself, whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound also in heaven. Therefore, whoever resists this power, thus ordained by God, resists the ordinance of God, unless he invent, like Manichaeus, two beginnings, which is false and judged by us heretical, since according to the testimony of Moses, it is not in the beginnings, but in the beginning that God created heaven and earth. Furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. In terms of relating this back in the broader context, this is the exemplar of hierocracy. This is the culmination, you can say, of the papal supremacist arguments of St. Gregory VII, going back to Innocent III. Innocent III, again, probably the greatest exponent of papal rights, but also Innocent III was probably the greatest and most intelligent of the popes and a supreme defender of this conception of hierocracy. However, this at this time was under assault by multiple fronts, even though politically you can say the Guelph and the Ghibelline conflicts have been playing out, representing this temporal feud between the popes, going back to the investiture controversy and the penance of Canossa and all of these things. This is now generating an even sort of greater conceptual intellectual battle. Writing in the specific dispute between Boniface VIII and King Philip of France, John of Paris, trying to aid Philip of France, wrote on royal and papal power that Christ's kingship was not of this world and could not be interpreted as temporal jurisdiction. Spiritual authority was united, the church, and essentially stewarded by the Pope. And this argument essentially focused on the dualism, or the naturally pluralistic relationship, which is that of, you can say, a joint authority between the Pope and representing the spiritual authority. And it wouldn't have been the emperor in this case, but in fact the king. However, Dante has allusions to this dualistic conception, but it's very clear that his justification for temporal power goes well beyond that of John of Paris. But of course, Dante, as we've sort of seen, has the benefit of not just being a mouthpiece for King Philip IV. Indeed, Philip IV is infamous for various reasons, which I don't have enough time to get into here. Dante is fully aware of the hornet's nest he's about to shake in terms of embarking on this feud within the context of the incredibly high stakes sort of Florentine Guelph competition and the arrival of Henry VII. And he begins his third book incredibly combatively. He shut the lions' mouths, and they did not harm me, for in his self-righteousness was found me, referring to the book of Daniel. Now it remains to deal with the truth of which cannot be brought to light without putting certain people to shame, and will therefore perhaps be a cause of some resentment against me. But since truth from its unchangeable throne implores us, Solomon too, entering the forest of Proverbs, teaches us by his own example to meditate on truth and loathe wickedness, and since our authority on morals, Aristotle urges us to destroy what touches us closely, for the sake of maintaining truth. And having taken heart from the words of Daniel cited above, in which divine power is said to be the shield, the defenders of truth, and putting on the breastplate of faith, as Paul exhorts us, a fire, with that burning coal which one of the seraphim took from the heavenly altar to touch Isaiah's lips. I shall enter the present arena, and by his arm, who freed us with the power of darkness, with his blood, believe the eyes of the world, I shall cast out the wicked and the lying from the ring. What shall I fear when the Spirit, who is co-eternal with the Father and the Son through the mouth of David, the righteousness, shall be everlasting remembrance and shall not be afraid of ill report? Essentially, you can say why the Pope justifies Unam Sanctum via his apostolic authority. Dante is trying to juxtapose this by essentially his right of genius, and his right of genius essentially being in some ways manifest of the will of Christ, as representing essentially the fight for truth. But nevertheless, you can probably understand why so many people thought he was being heretical. Those motivated by some zealous concern for Mother Church are unaware of that truth which we seek, and so it is with them, showing that reverence which a dutiful son owes his father, a dutiful son owes his mother, devout towards Christ, devout towards the Church, devout towards the shepherd, and devout towards all who profess the Christian religion, that I engage in battle in this book in the cause of truth. So he isn't fighting against the Pope. You can say he's rather fighting in a way to try and articulate a very specific form of relations between church power and temporal power, the conception of the Roman succession and the kingdom which is not of this world. So he isn't a Protestant. He isn't looking at this like the successors of Luther and refusing to partake in a ecumenical council, which in this case would be the Council of Trent in the 16th century, declaring we shall not join such an ecumenical council because it has been convened by the Antichrist, which of course the Protestants is the Pope. Dante is obviously fighting for much lower stakes when that, compared to that, and he's trying to emphasize again that he's in no way trying to invite accusations of schism, completely in contrast to what we see a few centuries later. And indeed, this isn't so much, again, an argument about theology, albeit it necessarily requires a level of spiritual exegesis, but rather this is a political treatise, and necessarily talking about the supreme temporal authority of the Pope as bestowed essentially by spiritual authority. One cannot, again, avoid the question of Scripture and overall conceptions of the Catholic Church when one is having to employ a political treatise within the grand scheme of medieval Europe. And we come to the idea of the two lights. The whole of the argument which follows will therefore be addressed to those people who assert that the authority of the empire is dependent on the authority of the Church in the same way as a builder is dependent on the architect. They are influenced by a number of different arguments, which they draw from the Holy Scripture and from certain actions both of the Supreme Pontiff and the Emperor himself, but they seek to have some support from reason on their side as well. Firstly, they say, basing themselves on Genesis, that God created two great lights, a greater light and a lesser light, so that one might rule the day and the other rule the night. These they took in an allegorical sense to mean the two powers, i.e. the spiritual and the temporal. They then go on to argue that just as the moon, which is the lesser light, has no light except that which it receives from the sun, in the same way the temporal power has no authority except that which it receives from the spiritual power. The argument here is implicit in Unam Sanctum, but the real advocate for the sun and the moon theory, of course, is Innocent III. So this is an argument of which essentially a religious debate that's been going on for hundreds of years at this point. And here is essentially Dante's rebuttal to that argument. Given that these two kinds of power are accidental properties of man, God would seem to have averted the natural order by producing accidents before their subject, which is an absurd claim to make about God, for those two lights were created on the fourth day, and man on the sixth, as is clear in the Bible. Further, given that those two powers guide men towards certain ends, we shall see presently, if man had remained in the state of innocence in which he was created by God, he would have had no need of such guidance. Such powers are thus remedies for the infirmity of sin. Therefore, since on the fourth day man was not only not a sinner, but he did not even exist, it would have been pointless to produce remedies, and this is against divine goodness. For it would be a foolish doctor who, before a man's birth, prepared a poultice for a future abscess. Therefore cannot be maintained that on the fourth day God created these two powers, and consequently Moses, meaning, cannot be what they pretend. Of course, the argument about creation, of course, is referenced in Unam Sanctam, but in terms of this overall sort of idea of the lights and using Genesis and creation as a counter, I come back to what Dante would be aware of, which is St. Augustine of Hippo and the idea of prevenient grace, and Thomas Aquinas as the prospect of grace being bestowed before incarnation. When one talks about the eternity of soul, the immortality of the soul, has the soul, like God, which essentially is separated from creation, beyond creation, but also a part of creation, especially through the Holy Spirit. If the soul exists independent of creation, before creation, and indeed, this isn't Catholicism, but this is applying later arguments in the Reformation, but applying Calvinism and the idea of unconditional election or irresistible grace. The idea essentially then becomes that God had essentially preordained the salvation of souls before the incarnation of man. And if this were essentially true, which when sorry, my brain is completely gone. John Calvin. When John Calvin was conceiving of this argument, indeed, as with the Jansenists later and all of those who were talking about the nature of grace, they were trying to look back towards the church fathers in terms of trying to find various precedents for this. But it's something that Dante really doesn't address, the idea of the immortality of the soul preceding incarnation, in which, of course, the authority, essentially the sun and the moon, necessarily again is not representing immortal souls, would come after later. But of course, he is correct in the sense that sin, essentially, from which all temporal and spiritual authority is there to address, only comes after the creation of the sun and the moon. So the sun and the moon could not be created essentially to act as some sort of allegory to address Adam's original sin. But that again would presuppose that God did not already have foreknowledge, and in a sense, looking at things through the conception of eternity, that the sin had already essentially been created in terms of God's foreknowledge, rather than the actual act of the first sin. As you can probably tell, that is an incredibly complicated subject in terms of trying to get into, and because Dante doesn't really refer to this either, I don't really want to go down on this tangent, but necessarily it comes the act of how can there be foreknowledge or a constituted authority, the light, the sun and the moon, which is there to address something which has not yet happened. So going on into the meaning of heaven's light. Although the moon does not have light in abundance, except in so far as it receives it from the sun, it does not follow that from this the moon derives from the sun, for it must be grasped that the moon's existence is one thing, its power another, and its function another again. As far as its existence is concerned, the moon is in no way dependent on the sun, nor is it as far as the powers are concerned, nor in any absolute sense, as far as the function is concerned. For its movement occurs by its own motion, and its influence comes from its own rays. It has some light of its own, and this is apparent in its eclipse. but as far as functioning better and more efficient is concerned, it receives something from the sun, namely abundant light. Having received this, it operates more efficaciously. Thus I say that the temporal realm does not owe its existence to the spiritual realm, nor to its power, which is its authority, and not even its function in an absolute sense. But it does receive its capacity to operate more efficaciously through the light of grace, which in heaven and on earth is the blessing of the Supreme Pontiff infuses into it. And thus the argument contained a formal error, for the predicate in the conclusion was not the same as the predicate of the major premise, as is obvious, for it runs like this: the moon receives its light from the sun, which is the spiritual power. The temporal power is the moon, therefore the temporal power receives its authority from the spiritual power. For in the predicate of the major premise they put light, whereas in the predicate of the conclusion they put authority. There are different things in respect to this subject and the meaning, as we have seen. So this, you can say, far more interesting than the hearkening back to Genesis is, you can say, the crux, what is meant by the spiritual authority animating, lighting the moon, which represents temporal authority. It is offer divine light. It is to offer guidance. It is to offer men who inhabit the natural world to achieve salvation. But Dante's crux here, which again, his whole argument is syllogistic, is based on first principles, is to argue that they have achieved and justified very correctly, the popes, that they represent the light, they represent enlightenment, literally, they represent spiritual guidance, they represent the authority of a shepherd tending to his sheep, but that does not imply, again, authority. Authority, essentially, in terms of how the popes conceive it, as Gregory VII, is the ability to declare any Christian ruler deposed, effectively. And this goes back to the study of Kings, the Book of Kings, the fact that Samuel and King Saul, the creation, the deposition, all of these sort of things. And he also goes into the role of what is the relationship of a vicar of Christ as distinct from a messenger, which represents some form of divine revelation. Is the role of a vicar simply to administer, as opposed essentially to be the voice of God, in which case the vicar of Christ is in some way usurping the role of God if he claims to represent some form of divine direct revelation. All of this is very interesting, but I find most compelling about Dante's argument, again, is the distinction between spiritual and temporal, is that the light represents the path to salvation, but it does not in itself represent temporal authority. I was going to go on a lengthy exposition about the two swords, but unfortunately, as you can probably tell, my my voice is giving away, so I'm going to instead focus on the donation of Constantine, because again, I've already referenced via Cary to Nederman that this is an explicit argument in terms of temporal authority. But regarding the two swords, just to very quickly summarize Dante's argument, Dante effectively views the misconception of the two swords representing spiritual and temporal authority bestowed onto Peter. It comes from a theological misreading. And in terms of evaluating this as a political treatise, I think that sort of goes beyond the parameters of what I'm really able to discuss here. So even though it's an interesting theory, and again, everyone reading this, I would advise you to go off and read De Monarchia, because obviously for the benefit of a short stream, I'm selecting points and I'm paraphrasing elements. So do go away and not just read the book, but read all the extended material as well, or at least I hope you'll at least try and take a stab at it. So going to the donation of Constantine. Some people maintain that the Emperor Constantine, cured of leprosy by the intercession of Sylvester, who was then Supreme Pontiff, made a gift of the Church of the seat of empire, i.e. Rome, along with many other imperial privileges. From this they argue that since that time no one can take on those imperial privileges unless he receives from them from the Church to whom they say they belong, and would indeed follow that this claim, the one authority was dependent on the other as they claim. Having stated and refuted those arguments which appear to be based on the word of God, is now to remit and now remains the state and refute those who are based on human actions and human reason. The first of these is the one just referred to, which they formulate as a syllogism in this way: those things which belong to the church can be held legitimately by someone to whom the church has granted, and this we concede. Roman sovereign authority belongs to the church, therefore no one can hold it legitimately unless granted by the church. And they prove the minor premise which reference to which was touched on earlier about Constantine. It is this minor premise which I therefore deny, and which they cannot prove. I say their proof proves nothing, because Constantine was not in a position to give away the privileges of empire, nor was the church in a position to accept them. And if they stubbornly insist my point can be proved in this way, nobody has the right to do things because an office he holds, which are in conflict with that office, otherwise one and the same thing would oppose itself in its own nature, which is impossible, but to divide the empire in its conflict which the office bestowed on the emperor, since his task is also to hold mankind in obedience to a single will, in commands and its prohibitions, as can easily be seen from the first book of this treatise. This idea of Constantine actually, if he were invested with that authority, being unable to alienate the authority. Of course, this is alluded to various times in terms of sort of legal jurisprudence. It actually comes across this idea of alienation in terms of the scheme of the the 100 Years' War, and the idea the king does not actually have the authority, say, for example, to scupper the succession, which in the case of France would be the Salic law vis-a-vis Henry V of England. But it's very interesting because this is actually the argument for papal infallibility, that the Pope essentially cannot supersede the office of the Pope. The Pope essentially is not the man who inhabits the office. The Pope merely is the receptacle, the sort of temporary custodian of that office. And if temporal authority by natural right has vested the empire in Constantine, then Constantine, as the holder of the office of the Roman emperor, cannot alienate that position and cannot fracture the empire. And when he talks about alienation, I'm sure some people will talk to the idea of the tetrarchy and the division of the empire into east and west, but that nevertheless considered that all of Rome was still one imperial continuum, represented by essentially clients, one or colleagues rather, one ruling in the west and one ruling in the east, as opposed to the alienation of temporal authority, which essentially, again, Dante refers to the Roman authority, temporal authority, as justified by divine right, which has instead been given to another type of authority, which in this case would be spiritual authority. Thus, if certain privileges have been taken away from the empire by Constantine, as they maintain, and passed into the control of the church, that seamless garment which would have been torn, which even those who pierced Christ, the true God, with their lance, dared not divide. Moreover, just as the church has its foundation, so too the empire has its own. For the foundation of the church is Christ. Hence the apostle in Corinthians says, "For others' foundation can no man lay claim than it is laid, which is Jesus Christ. He is the rock on which the church is built. But the foundation of the empire is human right. Now I say that as the church is not allowed to act against its own foundation, but must always rest upon it, in accordance with those words of the Song of Solomon, who is this that cometh up from the wilderness, flowering with delights, leaning upon her beloved? So too the empire is not allowed to do anything which is in conflict with human right. But if the empire were to destroy itself, that would conflict with human right. Therefore the empire is not allowed to destroy itself. Therefore, since to divide the empire would be to destroy it, the empire consists precisely in the unity of the universal monarchy. It is clear that whoever embodies imperial authority is not allowed to divide the empire, for it is clear, as we have said, to destroy the empire is in conflict with the rights of nature. Of course, the irony of all of this, I'm sure the more sort of astute of you in the audience know, that not only has Dante provided you can say, a very effective refutation of the donation of Constantine, but it's also a redundant point because the donation of Constantine was a forgery. And it was a forgery used around the time of the donations of Pepin to justify the transition of the Exarchate of Ravenna under Carolingian authority becoming essentially the Papal States. And it was this donation of Constantine again, was this dubious essentially authority vested on by Constantine to justify essentially the right of the popes not just to have their temporal possession in the city of Rome, again, which Dante considers a usurpation because Rome is part of the universal monarchy, the universal empire, the universal Christian monarchy. But then it becomes doubly so a usurpation when Gregory VII believes that he can essentially depose monarchs at will, or at least force them into a state of excommunication, such as with the Emperor Henry IV during the investiture controversy. There's also another argument here, which is the idea he actually gets this wrong when he talks about the failure of Translatio Imperii, which again goes back into the Byzantine argument. But the fact he gets this wrong in terms of his limited corpus of historical knowledge when he talks about Hadrian rather than Pope Leo III. Leo III crowning the Emperor Charlemagne, thus effectively establishing the Holy Roman Empire as the sort of a link for what later become Catholic Imperium or Catholic monarchy, and thereby Dante again deviates from the strict pattern of sort of Ghibelline apologetics. Again, all of this is to illustrate that Leo III's authority rested essentially on a phantom authority, which in turn was related to the donation of Constantine, which ironically again is an authority which was created by an empire. So Constantine creates the Pope as a temporal authority, who in turn creates another emperor. You can see for Dante, it sort of represents, there is a certain absurdity in terms of trying to reason away that argument. And then, of course, he spends a large part of the remaining sections of this focused on the relationship between the two powers as representing a form of dualism, i.e., a relationship, of course, which cannot necessarily imply that one is the father and one is the son, as the Pope would claim to. But again, one represents the spiritual light, and one represents essentially the temporal authority. And this is, again, perhaps echoing elements of John of Paris's argument. But again, that's not to say that John of Paris was necessarily an originator of that. So I've talked about Unam Sanctum. And in response specifically to the expedition of the Emperor Henry VII, the Pope, who would come after Clement, John XXII, would promulgate Si Fratrum, a warning lest anyone dare to assume the title of the imperial vicar when the empire is left vacant. I've included this in the description if people want to read it for themselves, but this isn't so much an argument against the sort of conceptual nature of sort of Dante's points. Dante was still alive when John XXII was promulgating his bull, but rather Si Fratrum was an attempt essentially to decimate the lingering Ghibelline structures that Henry VII had established between 1311 and 1313, that brief stint again in Italy. And in order to do so, Pope John XXII effectively invokes the hierocratic conceptions of the Pope as wielding supreme temporal authority, in this case specifically in the instance of Italy. You can say an attempt again to wrestle the temporal authority away from the Ghibellines and to restore some sort of Guelph hegemony in Italy. For people who want to look more into the point-by-point religious disputations, there's a very interesting book by Anthony Cassell. It's a very old book, but it was recently republished, 2004, which is the Monarchia Controversy and Historical Study, with essentially Guido Vernani's reflections on the Monarchia and relating this back to the bull Si Fratrum of John XXII. The ironic thing again is that even though Vernani and his arguments essentially have formed the popes going forward in how to deal with the points made across into Monarchia, Guido Vernani has been completely buried for posterity, whereas Dante has survived. And it has taken essentially a restoration of scholarship to go through the archives and essentially revive this disputation from the 14th century. And of course, the irony of all of this is that this incredibly high stakes conflict between universal dominion within Christendom, as if universal temporal authority were essentially to be held by a pope or a king representing the equivalent powers that the pope would claim, we enter the nadir of the papacy, not just the Avignon papacy, but the formal schism between the Roman papacy, the Avignon papacy, and even for a brief time, the Pisan papacy as well. It is later followed in terms of trying to restore this. The agent who attempts to restore the schism is an emperor, again, as we see with Otto and the reforming popes, which is something, again, Dante brings forward, that the whole Reformation movement, which culminates in Gregory VII and these arguments pertaining to papal supremacy, is actually the result of an anti-corruption reformist agenda, which was not implemented by the popes who were part of the Circadium Obscurum, the Dark Age, or the Theophylacty, or the pornocracy it's been referred to. All of these, you can say, far more stringent admonitions against the papacy were actually brought along by Petrarch, not Dante, hence why Petrarch is sort of embraced by the Renaissance school as opposed to Dante, which I think has been pretty conclusively proven, actually, that he still remains to the medieval tradition, just based on my own sort of musings here. But in a like sense, as with Otto, the Emperor Sigismund is the one essentially responsible for restoring the papacy and removing the schism. And this temporarily leads to the triumph of an argument called conciliarism, which is the idea that the ecumenical council, the meeting of all of the bishops, has preeminence over the Pope. And this argument would perhaps achieve its most sort of visceral sort of expression, epitomized expression at the Council of Basel, which of course was an offshoot from the Council of Florence. There are many sort of echoes in terms of the universal imperial idea. I go to the Emperor Charles V on Habsburg and the prophecy of the universal empire, the defeat, essentially the restoration of Constantinople, the defeat of the Ottomans, and the coming of Christ, and go back to figures like Macuna de Gattinara. Then go back to the idea of the Council of Trent and the Reform movement, and the fact that during that the Monarchia was essentially placed on the Index. However, it was published in Basel in 1558, and thereafter it was essentially more accessible to Protestant readers than it was necessarily Catholic readers due to the prohibitions of the Index. But nevertheless, that is not to represent some sort of triumph of hierocracy. When, say, for example, looking at Robert Bellamy, who was one of the most influential theologians of the latter part of the 16th century, Bellamy contests this idea that the Pope is a temporal ruler, that temporal rulers do not divide their authority from God, but again, the idea that temporal authority is a form of servitude to those who are governed. Emphasis on natural right as opposed to divine right in the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. And this was the De Potestas Summi Pontifici, along with the disputations of Robert Bellarmine. All of this echoes Dante's conflict with Boniface VIII, because this was directed against Pope Sixtus V, who you can say was the last sort of real hierocratic medieval pope, the pope who wanted to install a relative on the throne of France, the pope who wouldn't recognize Henry of Navarre as king, the pope who supported the Spanish Armada, the pope who wanted to conquer the Ottoman Empire. One of the most energetic and ambitious of all the popes, tried to place the disputations on the Index, in contrast to Robert Bellamy, only for his successor, Urban VII, in his incredibly short papacy of only a couple of weeks, to instantly remove it from the Index in terms of prioritization of arguments. So, as we see through these sort of historical echoes, in some senses, Dante would have the last laugh. These arguments, I believe, are very much echoed through someone I really want to cover on this series in Truthful Chamber, which is Tommaso Campanella. And I started off in terms of royal justice by bringing in St. Louis IX. But I also wanted to refer this back to Louis XIV, and this is the point here, which is the Declaration of the Clergy of France. You can say Gallicanism, which is essentially the rights and prerogatives of the King of France to appoint his own bishops, achieved its sort of zenith under Louis XIV. And had Louis XIV, say, for example, been able to establish, a definitive presence in Germany and in Italy, had England essentially not been taken over by the Dutch coup, all of these elements, can you say, facilitate the idea, as Campanella believed after the demise of Spain at the end of the Golden Age, that France, for a brief period of time between the 1670s and 80s, could represent that restoration of Henry VII, that restoration of imperial monarchy. Alas, those ideas were very quickly dashed from 1688 onwards. To conclude, there is a historian called Derek Davis who focuses on the origins of the modern secular state in Dante. In this, you can say Davis wrestles with this question of Dante belonging in the construct of historiography to the Renaissance, the medieval ages. The danger in considering Dante as modern, or even sort of closer to Petrarch, is that, as I've tried to prove, Dante's Catholicism is not just an aspect of his work, but it is absolutely fundamental. How else can one conceive of the basis of temporal power in a world as a sequence of miracles? It is a worldview that is almost impenetrable to modern readers, especially non-Catholics. It is less an admonition against the papacy, as even sadly Prue Shaw implies, but an attempt to rescue an institution not of this world and provide a theological and moral justification for temporal political authority. Indeed, a vision of political harmony as attempting to reflect the order of heaven, though never deluding itself that it can ever supplant it.